welcome to this webinar which we're sending out through the webnet from Imperial College London. My name is Dr. Robert Gross, and I'm the Director of the Centre for Energy Policy and Technology at Imperial College, and I am your chair. I will be introducing our two speakers shortly. I understand that we've got something like 68 participants for this webinar online, and this is the second of our webinars for the MOOC on clean power. And the focus of the discussion and the questions this afternoon, or this morning, or this evening, depending on where you are, is on creating a pro-renewables policy environment. So just to introduce my two speakers, I'll ask them to introduce themselves in a bit more detail. The first is Dr. Jeff Hardy, who's a Senior Research Fellow at the Grantham Institute, and has a long track record of working in policy design and development, both in a research context and with the British energy regulator. And joining us remotely from IRENA is Dr. Xavier Garcia Casals, I hope I've pronounced that correctly, who's a senior expert on the energy transition at the policy unit from IRENA, where he works in the Knowledge, Policy and Finance Centre and leads the transition to lower carbon system, power system and market design. I'll allow him to say a bit more about himself. Now, I think the order is that we start with Jeff. Jeff's going to, oh, actually, my notes say that Jeff is going to provide her perspective. Talking about a successful renewables policy environment, and then Xavier is going to give his perspective on the similar things. So just so that everyone's aware of the sequence of events, we then move to some Q&A, which I will convene, and we wrap up at 3:15, I think. So welcome, and Jeff.
Thank you very much, Rob. I suppose I'm responsible for this MOOC. So I convened most of the contents. I worked with some very talented researchers to put it all together, and I approached many very interesting speakers to provide some more kind of like voices to the content. My own background is, as Rob said, so I suppose I'm an energy policy and regulatory specialist. I've spent time working for an energy regulator in the UK. I've also worked in government, and now I'm back in research, thinking about what the future of regulation is. What does regulation look like in a net zero world? That's a lot of what keeps me going during the day and sometimes awake at night. I'm also on the board of a renewable electricity developer as well. So I'm part of a company that develops these projects in the UK. So I have some insight into what it takes to get a project done, be it a large solar farm, be it a large battery, or be it electric vehicle charging. But I don't know too much about international projects, which is where I really hope Javier is going to help us out on that side of things. So, Zara, slides. Yeah. So I've put just a couple of slides together to kind of like help me explain a little bit about this. While the first one's coming up, let me put it in context. So the reason why renewables are important is because energy itself is responsible for around 2/3 of global greenhouse gas emissions, and electricity alone around 1/3. So if we're going to reach net zero, or if we're going to hit things like the Paris Agreement on climate change to restrict global warming to 2 degrees and as close to 1.5 degrees as is possible above pre-industrial levels, electricity is going to be massively important. Now, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, produced their reports on what that means. And one of their most important statements, with perfect timing, is that it will take around 70 to 80% of our global power to come from renewable electricity if we're going to meet that target of restricting global warming. So that's the thing to have in context. You know, that's why we're doing it. There's lots of other good reasons why we're doing it as well. It's actually about the cheapest form of power going at the moment. And companies are actually saving money by investing in renewables, but we'll come on to that later. So if you flick on to the next slide, what I'm going to do is really quickly take you through the structure of the course. Some of you might have taken the course, other of you might be interested in taking the course. So let me take you through what it is, the kind of the journey you go through on this course. So it really has 5 key elements to it. The first is, how do you set meaningful targets and your policy objectives? So a meaningful target is a target for renewable electricity and other energy policies that is achievable. And that means you need to understand your resources, you need to understand what's economically feasible, and you need to have an understanding of what your objective is in doing that. So if I put that in context, for example, the European Union has a renewable energy target, and its objective in achieving that renewable energy target is to become a world leader in renewables. You know, so it's a very clear objective of a place. The second element is, if you're going to have a pro-renewables policy, what you need to do is to put renewables on a level playing field with other technologies. And what that means is the policies you have for connecting technologies to an electricity grid, how pricing differs between different technologies, how the markets work, whether the skills are available for your supply chain, and whether the subsidies are fair across the place, so that you're not subsidizing one form of generation compared to another. The third element is you're going to want to get stuff built in a place, and that means you need to mobilize the supply chain and you need to mobilize the investment behind that. So the supply chain is all about getting the right conditions. So it links with your objectives. Do you want to generate a supply chain locally? Do you want to capture a lot of that value in a place? Or do you want to bring international supply chains to a country in order to deploy quickly? And one of the key roles in all of that is going to be the developer. So developers develop renewable projects, which means that basically they identify the sites where you can place renewables, like sites for wind farms or solar farms or offshore wind or whatever it might be. They go through all of the legal processes, the permitting, the environmental regulations, the licensing. They get projects built, and sometimes they go on and operate them, depending on what business model they have. Another incredibly important actor in that is the investor. Now, investors tend to come in 2 forms, either debt financing, so banks lending money, or equity, so someone taking a stake in a company or in a project. But the simple thing that works for both of them is understanding the risks of that project. So that's all about, from a debt perspective, the best they can do is get their money back. So they're going to be very conservative about how they lend money. And an equity investor might take on board higher risk, but they will want a commensurately higher return on the back of that. So understanding risks and mitigating those risks in order to reduce the cost of that finance is going to be a very important part of any pro-renewables policy. In terms of the policies themselves, then there's a whole range of things that might be important in there. So for example, you might want to incentivize, subsidize renewables. Let's say you have a very low renewables base, then you might want to apply some of the very simple approaches to subsidy, like feed-in tariffs and so forth. But as you get more mature, you might want to move to competitive auctions and so forth. And I'm sure we're going to touch on that as we go through. But you might also want to be putting in place other things to get a supply chain going, like tax breaks, tax assistance on production, or grants and kind of like government-backed loans, those kind of things that can really help things get going. And then finally, another important aspect is to consider your stakeholders within a place. So your communities and your businesses, because if you can get communities, let's put it a different way, communities are going to host a lot of this infrastructure. So, you know, renewable energy can be very local in nature, and therefore if communities benefit from those renewables, or possibly even are invested in those renewables and therefore sharing the benefits, then that is much more likely to be a happy coexistence of the technologies and the local communities. The other side of it is businesses are becoming increasingly important in the rollout of renewables, because corporations are becoming massive purchasers of renewable energy. So if you look at the companies that are most heavily invested into renewable electricity, it is the really big tech companies. Google, Amazon, Microsoft, etc. They've all got a huge stake in renewables. They own a lot of renewable assets, and they also have power purchase agreements with an awful lot of renewables. And therefore, there's two reasons for that, really. So one is a corporate social responsibility element, but the second one is price protection. So by signing PPAs, power purchase agreements with renewables, they can protect themselves against higher prices or price risk for energy elsewhere in the system. So that's it. I'm going to stop at that canter through the programme, and I think we're going to hand over to Javier to do introductions to himself, and also to tell us a little bit about his perspectives on pro-renewables policy.
That's great. Thank you very much, Jeff. And indeed, Xavier, it's over to you now. Just looking to our off-screen colleague who's managing the tech. Do we have slides?
You might be able to share them themselves actually.
So Xavier, can you see your own slides on your screen, and are you able to share them through this?
I cannot see them on my screen, but it's okay. I can just, if somebody can change them for me.
Okay, yeah, we'd be right with you.
Yeah. Maybe get started.
Why don't you say a bit about yourself while we're bringing up the slides?
Yeah. So now we have the first slide, isn't it?
We don't have the slides up on the screen here yet.
They're coming, but maybe just introduce yourself briefly.
Yeah.
Then anyway, I'll start. So basically, if I understood it properly, now we were kind of trying to focus on what makes a renewables-friendly policy environment. And basically, I think that there are many things that are interlinked, as Jeff very nicely exposed. But I think that there is a kind of underlying element, which is having a clear vision. A clear vision that drives all the other elements and puts them together and tries to build from here something that is holistic and that speaks to each other, that each part speaks to each other. You know? The clear vision starts before with a clear understanding and a clear communication of the urgency itself. I mean, I saw the numbers that Jeff was presenting, about 80% renewable power. When I see these numbers, which are in many scenarios and I get a bit frightened, because I mean the problem goes far beyond the power sector. So power sector is 20% of the energy sector only, and there are even other sectors beyond the energy sector that are contributing to emissions. So the project has a much bigger dimension, and the urgency, I think we still did not grasp it completely. I mean, basically we have a carbon budget for the next less than 10 years if we keep on going at the current level of emissions. And this means that we are facing an extremely tight process in order to adapt not our energy system only, but the whole of our socio-economic system to a completely new context. And this is a sense of urgency that needs to be impregnating all this vision and all the policies that come below it. Then another element that I find important, and sometimes I find it also missing, it's kind of having an holistic approach to it. So it's not only about power, it's not only about the energy system, it's not only about renewables themselves, it goes beyond that, no? When here in the first slide we see something very typical when there is most of the exercises that try to model the transition and to see what happens, because the scenarios, in the scenarios they are nothing, they exist only on paper, no? But if they are analyzed and the consequences from them, they are properly understood, they can inform the process that we have ahead. And many scenarios, they have a very narrow focus, for example, in the power system, no? But the power system is embedded in the whole energy system, which is embedded in the economy, which is embedded in society, which is embedded in the planet. So at the end, we have a systemic interaction and many feedbacks between many of those systems that require an holistic approach from our side. And then there is this big component also underlying that goes beyond these systems and addresses some dimensions that we have kind of forgotten through the evolution that we follow up till now, and that now they become very, very burning, because I mean, they become a matter of necessity or even a matter of whether we will be able to materialize a transition that is aligned with the goals that we are having, which basically are elements of justice and elements of fairness on how we share the costs and the benefit from this transition, and how, for example, all these renewable energy developments that we were speaking and we will be speaking throughout all the session, how they are materialized. I mean, it's only driven by getting some returns on investment, or it's driven by something more deeply embedded into the social system and with a wider participation from the whole society. Because if it's only a matter of a business, I mean, we have seen a big push up till now with the cost of renewables going down, but I'm afraid it's not enough for the kind of full transformation that we are aiming at. So we need to look a bit beyond that. No?
Okay.
Then if you can go to the next slide.
Okay.
That's the kind of analysis that we try to do to gain insights on all these implications from transition processes and how they interact with the socioeconomic system outlook, and to provide, to try to contribute, providing this envelope on an holistic view on how the different policies interact with them and what final outcomes we are getting from this process. So basically we have different energy transition roadmaps. We can have also different socioeconomic outlooks, and there are many things we can change structurally on how our socioeconomic system can evolve. And the reality is that when we try to implement a transition, when we try to deploy renewables, when we try to reach some targets, there are a myriad of interactions and feedbacks between the socioeconomic system and the energy transition roadmap that we are trying to implement, that at the end of the day imply that the outcome of all these interactions can be completely different from the original energy transition roadmap we had on paper. So we try to gain some insights on this. Sorry, I got disconnected, I think. I don't know if I'm still there.
We can still see you.
It's all fine. It's all fine. We can still see.
Okay, so then it's only my screen.
Yeah. We have your second slide.
Okay, okay. Now I see you again. Yes, I thought I was completely out of the game.
We're all experimenting with the hardware and the software.
Yeah. So the idea is getting out from this planning, from these policies only from the energy sector, getting a wider insight on the interactions with the rest of the socioeconomic system, and this we measure it through what we call the socioeconomic footprint, which basically it's decomposing in terms of macroeconomic and social indicators, employment, GDP, but also welfare. What's the effect of trying to deploy this transition? And this all tries to go on providing these feedbacks on the holistic view that we need for addressing and planning this transition. Then another thing that we also need, and sometimes we take it by granted, they are fit for purpose institutions and structures. And for example, if we go to the power system, which is a very small part of the problem, but it's a relevant part of the problem, because once we start integrating the energy system, most of it pivotates around the power system. So it can play a very important role. And the structures that we have, for example, in regions like in Europe, where we have liberalized markets, the markets that we have, they were not thought for this kind of energy system. They were thought for a system that is completely different. And we are trying to advance on this process of radical transformation of the energy system and everything that involves it with these structures that were not designed, were not envisioned for supporting these new technologies that are going to be the basis of the new energy system. And we do it by introducing different fixes around the current structure, but fixes, they have the peculiar behavior to start interacting with each other and interacting with the structure. So at the end, we can get a lot of noise and find ourselves in a situation that we are creating barriers more than supporting an environment that can push ahead this kind of transition. So for example, there are myriad of market design misalignments that we still need to face properly, and we need to address them and reconvert this structure, this basic structure, which is the power system organizational structure, to reconvert it to something that avoids all these misalignments and that can support and maintain the transition process and the system that will come after it. Because I mean, for example, if we go now to the current marginal market and we envision a system based on variable renewables, we have almost zero prices in the market. And if we have zero prices, how is the investment going to be supported? I mean, the risk becomes huge. This means stopping any additional activity on deploying more renewables, and not only renewables, because I mean, renewables, it's a big part of it, but there are many other investments that need to be faced for this transition, even without going outside of the energy sector, that also there are a lot of need of investments to be there to support this transition. But within the energy sector, we have even maybe bigger contributions on energy efficiency, on energy flexibility, on integration, on electrification. So there are many other investments that need to have an appropriate context so that they can be materialized. So I think I'll leave it here because I don't know, but perhaps I'm already out of the timing.
It's fine. Is there a third slide, or is that your last slide? So we have one more slide of yours. If there's anything there that you want to.
That's right.
Fairness.
Yeah. This one, I think it's something that at some point it would be good that we can touch upon these elements, because they are too easily forgotten. I mean, nowadays we start hearing more speaking about justice. I mean, both of them, justice and fairness, I mean, what they have in common is that without them, we cannot expect any sensible transition that leads us towards sustainability and that provides a resilient system to navigate all what we have already on the pipeline. No? Justice is more associated to not leaving behind all those people and part of the society that has been involved in the fossil fuel era to provide us for the energy we needed. And this dimension, it's a dimension that becomes more acknowledged, and there is more talk about it because there are very direct feedbacks from the transition on it. I mean, when we start pushing this transition ahead, we see jobs increasing in some areas and jobs decreasing in other areas, but it's not only the jobs, it's also the communities that were based on this economic activity that can be collapsing. And then if we don't address these things, many people, they are going to be feeling as losers in the transition process. They won't be on board, and without having them on board, there is no way that we can address a challenge like this one. So about justice, we hear more about it. It's still very limited on the fossil fuels against renewable jobs issue, which it's clearly a misalignment, but there are other misalignments. I mean, for example, in the analysis that we do from the socio-economic footprint, we find out that other sectors in the economy are losing jobs when we have a transition. Overall, we are gaining jobs because renewables produce more jobs than the ones that are being lost in fossil fuels. But there are jobs being lost also in other economic sectors because the whole of the economic system reorients itself. There is certain crowding out affecting other sectors, and we see jobs that are being disappearing. And this it produces a misalignment that has a lot of components. It's temporal, it's spatial, it's regarding skills. It has many implications that if we do not address them, we introduce at the end of the day transition barriers. And this is a component that is being addressed in the late times. Every time I think we hear speaking more about it, still limited to the fossil fuel versus renewables, but I think it's gonna progress. But there is another dimension which is more structural, which is fairness, which has to do, for example, with the responsibilities for the current situation and the capabilities to address it as of today. And this has been standing for very long in international discussions, but we did not advance on it. And it has deeper implications even beyond that of responsibilities between different regions in the world. Now, within a country itself, it has also very strong implications for distributional effects, for inequality in a country. Depending how we address the transition, we can leave many people out of place. I mean, if we start imposing high standards for energy efficiency and retiring from the market low efficiency households, or we start pushing for electric vehicles and retiring old fossil fuel vehicles, I mean, we are leaving people outside of the transport, outside of the housing. If we then introduce carbon taxes and we don't foresee adequate recovery mechanisms, we also are excluding a lot of people. And then what we'll be doing with the stranded assets that this transition can leave. I mean, depending how we address the stranded assets, again, will increase inequality. So if all these things, they are not addressed, basically what we can find is a backlash from the transition. I mean, because the transition process that is living, that we are following, if we would follow it properly, basically would lead to a very strong reductions in the market of fossil fuels and fossil fuel technologies. Basically, fossil fuel technologies will become essentially free, and fossil fuels would have a very low price because demand would be very low. And then if we don't have everybody on board, it's very easy that we revert the whole process and we start increasing emissions once we thought that, at least in the global north, we had already done our homework. No?
Okay.
So perhaps, yeah.
So I think what we're going to do now, I'm glad that you brought in the issue of the just transition and explained that's quite multifaceted, both within societies and internationally and across countries of different income groups. Now, the way that the webinar will work from now on is that we're going to move to some discussion and Q&A. I can see that there's a number of people online, and I can see that some of those people have said hello and have posted onto the chat. On the screen in front of me here, there'll be an opportunity for people to post their questions, and it might be sensible that if online participants have a question, that perhaps they start to post those now, so that we can get some queued ready to come in.
They could post to everyone as well.
They could post the question
rather than privately.
Right.
You guys will see the questions.
Otherwise
it will appear only on my computer.
Okay, so I'm being told that you should post your question publicly, and then otherwise it will have to be relayed to us from stage left. I just want to perhaps to pick up on some of the things that Xavier was saying, and also to come back to Jeff. I mean, in some respects, this MOOC is designed to provide something of introductory material, perhaps for individuals that might be coming into renewables for the first time, or moving from an engineering background into economics and policy, or perhaps in parts of the world where progress with renewables has been less progress with renewables than in some of the more advanced countries. So whilst I agree wholeheartedly with all of the wider societal piece, maybe we could just pull it back into some specifics, and maybe we need to give this a bit of an historical framing. We've talked a bit about zero subsidy renewables and the changes to electricity markets. That's a very, very hot topic in those countries like parts of Europe, the UK, parts of the US, where we're getting high shares of renewables. But if we just pull it back to, if you like to go back to the elementary aspects of this, what kinds of regulations, what kinds of approaches are pro-renewables and renewables investor friendly? I'll start with Jeff. Just a few examples. Perhaps historically, it might be the easiest way into that as to how renewables have taken off in the marketplace.
Yes. So I'm happy to start, and then Rabia, I'm definitely interested in your thoughts on this as well. So, so historically, there has been a number of mechanisms that have proven very successful in getting renewables deployed quickly. So from a very low level of renewables in a system to kind of like a reasonable penetration. And the sorts of policies that tend to work are the ones that are very, very simple. So things like a feed-in tariff, where you're just paid a fixed price for everything you inject into the grid from your site. That's a very bankable policy. It led to an immense amount of small-scale renewables in the UK, for example. Very, very quick deployment there. Things like obligations, so obliging one of the parties in the system to procure or to generate from their portfolio a certain amount of renewables is an incredibly effective policy as well, if it's done right. And kind of like other kind of relatively simple policies like net metering or net billing, which is, you know, your bill reflects kind of like if you have renewables, your bill reflects kind of like both what you generated and what you consumed, and it nets one off against the other. So it's kind of like every single unit that you've produced comes off your bill in one way or another, and you can maybe even bank some of that.
Okay.
So very simple policies can really get things going incredibly quickly, with a couple of caveats.
Okay.
One is, let's say for feed-in tariffs, being able to control it, because what has happened many, many times is the cost of technologies have fallen much faster than the cost of the subsidy, which means that you're overpaying. So you need very good control mechanisms, good market monitoring, good market intelligence, and the ability to change things, not proactively, retrospectively, but proactively going forwards. And things like obligations, it's all about having incredibly good compliance and monitoring regimes. So being sure that what is said is being procured and generated is truly renewable, as opposed to just some administrative or other way of calculating it, and no new renewables have been produced in the country.
Okay, so I don't know if Xavier, if you have anything that you would like to add to that, perhaps thinking about the basics and the fundamentals of a pro-renewables across the environment.
Yeah, in terms of scale, I completely agree with Jeff. So it's basically quotas and targets, and then pull mechanisms like feed-in tariffs or PPAs that have been providing the deployment that we have witnessed up till now. Another caveat that I would add is that if we don't frame them properly, those policies that worked in the past, they could reach a ceiling from where they cannot be more effective if we don't provide the appropriate structure. No? But up till now, it has been the most effective in the power sector. Also, we also need to say this because in other sectors, in other energy sectors, they have not been that effective. They have not been formulated like this, although there have been some attempts, but there has been no this efficiency in promoting the deployment of renewables. And then also we have another dimension, which is different, which is the energy access dimension that works with other parameters that are different. And there we have seen also positive policies on pushing it ahead, but they revolve more about providing the right institutional framework, about facilitating the vision, for example, on mini grids. If you want investment on mini grids, what's going to happen when the big grid arrives there or the main grid arrives there, how tariffs are set. So there are many things that have been interacting. And in fact, I think it's somehow nice because policies, they have not been always the main driver. They have been mixed somehow with other evolutions, like, for example, for offshore electricity supply, with all the ways to make finance accessible to people that they are not accessing, let's say, formal finance with pay-as-you-go schemes or other kind of purchase that have mixed with policy, and policy then proactively has been interacting with them, and they are producing a nice ecosystem to push these other applications ahead. But I also would say that we have still a long way to go. I mean, these policies work nicely up till now, but they are hitting some boundaries, like, for example, the very design of of the market, of the power system market, and we need to, because I mean what they have been triggering is different fixes to the power system market to complement the undesired effects of these policies in the rest of the power system. So we need to step back and provide a consistent framework for them to be working also in the future.
Okay, so I think we can come back to some of those issues. I'd like to ask you a few questions, perhaps around the use of auctions and around institutions and stakeholders. And I completely take the point about off-grid and access provision and the kind of different requirements there. I personally have huge amount of interest in how the electricity market might need to be redesigned, and actually I don't think that internationally there's a consensus on the answer to that as we move to high penetrations of zero marginal cost renewables. But we've got a question from Thomas, which is how do you deal with the issue of lock-in or path dependency basically lock into fossil fuel-based energy for power generation? And I guess what he means here is that Systemi is designed around fossil fuels, and there's also a temporal lock-in in that you build a gas-fired power station, it'll probably stay on the system for another 15, 20 years at least. So any reactions to that question, gentlemen?
I can start.
I am kind of looking at you.
You were. So
Xavier can go first next time.
Okay, so let me give some initial and quick thoughts, and I'll leave plenty of time for Xavier as well. So yes, there is a whole bunch of issues together here. I think one of the key things to consider is that if you're trying to increase the amount of renewables in let's say a quite developed energy system, what you're particularly where demand is quite flat, which it is in quite a lot of developed economies, for example, what you're not doing is what you're having to do is replace ultimately. If you look at the UK, the thing that has been replaced most recently is coal. We've gone from something like about 50% coal in the kind of like 70s, 80s to
80% coal until the 1990s.
Oh, there you go, 80% coal until 1990, to about 7-ish, give or take. Now, that's not necessarily an industry that's willingly bought into that transition in many ways. So there's been all sorts of mechanisms that have been around to help, let's say, the coal industry. So things like a capacity mechanism, so there is the availability of that backup generation in the system, and lots of other things. There's had to be quite a long, if you like, trend towards it. So some European air quality directives, etc., as well, that have like triggered the kind of like the future of this as well. So it does need a long run up, and sometimes you do have to pay people to come off the system.
All right. So sometimes there's no option but to force people off the system. And yeah, interesting. Might do an interesting contrast between Germany and the UK in that respect, really, where despite their great efforts and huge success with renewables, still burning significant amounts of coal in their generation mix, and carbon emissions are considerably higher per unit of electricity than those in the UK. Any thoughts on this path dependence point from you, Xavier?
Yeah, we also didn't speak about it before, but one strong policy element, it's paving the way for the phasing out of all this capacity that is there from fossil fuels, and accepting that some of it is going to be stranded, and then we need ways to manage it properly. I mean, what we cannot do is just because they are built to keep on burning them. I mean, as of today, as we are speaking, additional investments in coal around the world are taking place, and they are going to be lasting for the next 40 years. And there is no room to accommodate these emissions. And then there is a strong policy approach there, or policy action, that policy and beyond policy, because all the divestment movement, for example, has also given strong signals to investors on this field, no? Making them think that probably the investments will become standard in the future, no? But many of these, most of this generation of this fossil fuel generation needs to be phased out with an holistic approach. I mean, for example, some of the measures we can put in place, like its capacity mechanisms that were mentioned before, to kind of provide a support to some of these technologies that suddenly find that they cannot generate what they had foreseen in their business model, and this has happened in many places. The capacity mechanism, if it's not properly addressed, it can also become a barrier for the transition, which means taking out this capacity that is based on fossil fuels and plugging in new flexibility elements that are completely different and that work completely different from this natural gas capacity in the best of the cases, no? And this, it needs, I think, a proactive approach on accepting this stranding of assets and on finding ways that are accepted from the society. I mean, it's not only the companies involved in it, because there are many things that have been going on there. I mean, there are corporations that have been getting profit out of burning this fuel or promoting these investments in the last years when it was already clear what was the need. And then it's the bulk of the society that, if things are not properly done, maybe what we need to face in the future is a bailing out of these investments in the past. And this has very strong socio-economic implications, no? Need to be managed properly. But yeah, my idea is that they need to be phased out as fast as possible.
Okay, I mean, that's very interesting. I think that the context for that conversation around capacity payments is quite different if we're trying to move towards net zero from even maybe 5 years ago, where we might have been talking about 60% cut, and you could still afford to have a fair chunk of fossil fuel capacity on the system operating at low utilization levels, low load factors, and perhaps needing to be remunerated for its availability rather than the amount of energy it's generating. But we're getting more questions coming through from our audience, which I'm absolutely delighted about. So I'm going to move the topic on. So we have Marianne, and this is a question, I think, which is more to do with energy access in perhaps least developed countries. So I'll read. Hello, professors. So hello, Marianne. If we're taking the case study of a non-oil producing country with low energy coverage, what would be the main steps to introduce renewables to improve energy production? So I'm interpreting that as being perhaps a country where they need to improve access, which came into the conversation initially, but there may be slight misinterpretations, so please feel free to interpret that. But the main steps to introduce renewables to improve energy production. Why don't we go over to IRENA, to Xavier first.
So if I understood it properly, the context is a country that has not fossil fuel production activity, and how do we do it to incentivize the deployment of renewables there? So the first thing here is that there is an investment issue, which is many of these countries they are facing. That it's, I mean, the cost of finance on these countries can be 2 or 3 times higher than the cost of finance we are facing in Europe, for example, or in the United States. And there are a lot of risks involved to this financing also that are associated to the context in the country. So all these things, they need to be softened in order to pave the way for investments to take out on this country regarding the deployment of renewables. But even with this, that it's already a huge task, so accessing low cost financing and avoiding all the other risks that are associated to the context of the specific country. Beyond that, there is an element that links to the fair transition that we were commenting before on saying who needs to address these investments now. Because I mean, if these investments, they are not addressed in the proper way, the easy way forward for these countries will be in the following 10 years, when the cost of fossil fuels go down, we'll be investing in additional fossil fuels. And then we are all screwed. I mean, if we go that way, there is no potential transition we can do. So we need to face all these investments. What are the right mechanisms to support these investments in these countries so they can leapfrog the technological evolution that we follow now and build directly the kind of system that can support the future development. And this, it has also many links that go beyond that, because it's not only providing kilowatt hour. I mean, most of these deployments, they are linked to productive activity in the countries, which is what provides the feedback that can allow for a proper recovery of the investments, and that can produce the underlying economic development that can benefit these countries, because it's not a matter only of importing renewable equipment in different countries. It's a matter of internalizing, localizing all the supply chains from these technologies that are there, making them their own technologies, adapting them to the local reality, and counting with the external investment support for facilitating this way ahead. So I think there are many elements that need to be addressed.
Great. Anything to add to that?
Just a really quick one on top. So I completely agree on that, and I think the strong link to me is with the wider objectives of an energy policy. So is it to develop an indigenous industry? Is it to maximise social welfare? Is it to improve the environment in some way? You know, these things really start to dictate what pathway you go down with your renewables deployment. You know, because if you want to develop an indigenous supply chain, then you're going to have upskilling as part of that. You're going to be involving all sorts of communities and that kind of thing. But it's, you know, the overarching objectives are so important.
Okay, I mean, just maybe just to add a few thoughts of my own. I mean, I think there's clearly some basic things like resource assessment, understanding resource opportunities. There's a kind of upskilling of, in terms of institutional capacity and human capital, which is going to be at central government, local government, and community level. What we've seen is sort of micro-scale schemes have been very, very successful using microfinance. And we have seen many countries that have been used a very relatively traditional monopoly utility model to massively improve coverage. So that's in more middle-income countries. And I think we need this kind of meso level engagement and thinking through carefully as to what works, and adapting to local circumstances. So there's often a kind of a presupposition that there's an easily transferable set of tools from one country context to another, and that may be true as long as you have the institutional and human capacity that goes with it. So it's complex, but those kind of capabilities are hugely important. So we have Harrison Nicholson. Hi, folks. For countries rich in natural resources, what type of policies or programs would you recommend governments develop in order to retrain skilled and semi-skilled workers to better transition to renewables? Skills base is very, very. All three of these questions have been terrific, but the skills base is enormous, isn't it? Across all countries, actually.
Yes, it certainly is. And I guess part of that question was one of the motivations of the course in the first place. You know, so it was, you know, it's very targeted, if you like, at people moving into policy, people moving into renewables, you know, as a movement into a new career or a movement into a new kind of like place, and kind of like thinking about all of those complex factors that Xavier has been describing really well. So in that instance, I think coming back to what Rob was just talking about in terms of kind of like the resource assessment, the link with the wider kind of like socio-economic and environmental objectives, that's going to start to really help think about kind of like, if you're going to have, you know, a kind of like try and capture as much value locally in a supply chain, that will start to tell you a lot about the skill set you need. If you're going to be kind of like managing all of those risks in order to drive down the cost of finance, that's going to require other skill sets that are going to be important in there to kind of like make sure that the policy environment is consistent, level, all of that. There's a whole bunch of like interconnected things. So you need some very, what's the word, interdependent thinkers, kind of like some very integrated thinkers in there. There's a lot of so many connected issues in here. But then, yeah, it's kind of like then, depending on whether it's an access issue or not, there's a whole other.
I think this is more about rich countries. I think it might even be oil, you know, it might be fossil fuel producing states. So it talks about countries rich in natural resources. So it's kind of like a transition rather than an access question. Why don't we go over to Xavier to see if he's got any thoughts on this?
About this question exactly, or because I'm a bit lost now on where we went. So there was this last question, if you can please repeat it.
The last question is basically about what type of policies or programs would you recommend governments develop in order to retrain skilled and semi-skilled workers to better transition to renewables?
Okay, I think that, yeah, as we mentioned before, it requires action in many different dimensions of policy. It requires educational policy, it requires industrial policy, it requires finance, it requires many elements that interact between them. But one important element perhaps that needs to be captured here is anticipating the situation. So many of these let's say misalignments that can take place in the skills dimension or in the educational dimension, they cannot be sorted out once you have them in front of you. They have a time lag that require to form this skill workforce that can address those elements. So there are policies that in fact need to start now in order to bypass the current pathway they have already embedded into their system, which goes via fossil fuels, need to start already now to produce this prepared workforce that has a future that is clear set in front of them, which at the same time requires clear industrial policies to be put in place to support this kind of activities and to provide this kind of jobs. One of the elements that we find often when we analyze what's the impact that we can expect from the transition is that there is a considerable change in the split of skills that are needed, even if we go to basic skills, with a renewable pathway compared with the fossil fuel or conventional pathway that we are addressing now. Then having an insight on these skills, planning upstream of that beforehand, and providing the time for developing this workforce, it's maybe one of the most important policies that can be put in place to have the environment supportive of this transition. Then there are other elements that are associated, for example, to trade, other dimension, which I mean, it's completely different. But I mean, if we develop a trade dependency on this process, the scope for benefiting from all these transformations internally and from owning all the process of developing this new energy system, it's going to be transferred outside on a big extent, and it's going to be having technology dependency and having limited participation of local resources in the implementation of this new energy system. So basically, I think it revolves to a lot of anticipation, deciding that where you want to go is different from where all the other countries went beforehand, and trying to avoid replicating the same mistakes. For example, here it goes again back to how you configure, how you structure the power sector market or regulated system that you have. If you go following what was traced before by other countries, then you will be facing the need to amend it afterwards, which will introduce additional delays. If you have a clear vision in front of you of where you want to go, what industrial policies you put in place for your country to be able to localize most of this development, what skills you want to develop, you can jump directly to the appropriate structures to support this kind of system, and then leapfrog all the delays that would come. So I think anticipation, one element, and then prevention against policies that have been used in other places in other times that had other energy systems and other contexts for being deployed, and directly jumping into the new policies that can support the kind of system that you are going to.
Yeah, I mean, just to add a few thoughts on that of my own, I think there are examples of reskilling of installers. So if we think about the examples in the heat sector, those countries that have moved quite extensively away from oil-fired or gas-fired boilers to provide heating and are installing heat pumps. There's a very good case history there of certification and training schemes, often a kind of government industrial collaboration. It might be an industry standards board. So there's very, very clear learnings that we can take in those installer sectors. If we think about what the low carbon transition is going to require more widely, not just in terms of installing a lot more renewables, but we're also going to need to have much better made buildings that are better insulated, whatever the climate, because you don't want to be wasting energy. You want buildings that can have a certain amount of natural cooling, buildings that will stay warm and need less heating. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to transform the skills of the workforce. You have to take the existing skilled individuals that work in those sectors, and it's in some respects it's anticipation, which I think Rabia was alluding to. It's also believing that this is real. So you really need governments to take the leadership that actually this is not a passing fad. This is not something which is going to go out of fashion. It's something that for the next decades, for this half of the century, our endeavours need to be focused on tackling this problem. You know, we need to be equipping people with all sorts of different skills right through society, so that the people that are training to maintain internal combustion engine vehicles are going to need to be skilled in future to be able to maintain electric vehicles, or maybe hydrogen fueled vehicles in some parts of some sectors. So there's a whole set. It doesn't mean that we have to develop entirely new institutions. We already have institutions for training people. We need to think about the balance of skills that we need in the economy at different levels of tertiary and higher training, and we need to genuinely believe that this transition is required, and we need to align what we already do. We may be needing to do it better, but we already train people. We already train engineers. We already train construction workers, vehicle maintenance technicians. They need to be that we need to anticipate the requirement to move that onto a low carbon footing. So we don't have anything else coming up at the moment. Please don't be shy. Please, if you have questions, maybe we could just take this back to, if I may. I'm just going to take it back to the idea of a just transition. Just transition is extremely. There is a Just Transitions Commission in Britain. In the United States, we hear some of the political parties talking about a Green New Deal. So I wonder if we could just get some further thoughts about what's needed. In some respects, it touches on skills, doesn't it? It touches on a whole bunch of other things. So maybe we could just have a few additional thoughts. Rabia, anything else you'd like to add on can we have a just transition?
Can we have? We should have. And I think, I mean, those elements, they are now burning, because without them we can really advance the transition. But in many aspects, they are things that we should have addressed before already. I mean, in terms of the just transition, I mean, it makes more reference to the fairness element, so trying to avoid inequalities and distributional elements that can arise whatever evolution we have. In the terms of the just transition, it looks more focused, but I mean, it's wide, the issue. I mean, you were commenting before also about the workshop, for example, that currently is dealing with internal combustion engines and in the future needs to perhaps jump to electrical vehicles. I think there is a big job here that governments and institutions need to do to take part of the weight out of citizens. Because I mean, if you are working in a workshop with internal combustion engines, you cannot be left on your own facing the myriad of different professional reconversion opportunities you have in front of you, because then it simply collapses. I mean, simply you don't find a way out. So there needs to be a very guided approach and supportive approach on these reconversions. And sometimes they don't need to be so much specific. I mean, if you are working in internal combustion engines, not because the electrical vehicle also has 4 wheels, you need to jump into it. No, I mean, there are many elements in the economy and in the labor market that need to be readdressed. In fact, many segments of the economy that can be closer, for example, to the location where these jobs are being lost, be it in fossil fuels, be it in internal combustion engines, or being what else, and that can offer very interesting and attracting opportunities for a job reconversion that doesn't need to be linked directly to what you were doing before. And that can, I mean, I think the challenge for institutions and for governments is to provide a hopeful view of this. I mean, there can be improvement in this process. You can be leaving one job that it's contributing to global warming, and that perhaps you are also not, although it's the way you are learning, you're living up till now, and therefore it's hyper important for you, but maybe you are not enjoying fully what you're doing, and many other options can open now so that you can properly redirect yourself on a direction that you can contribute better to the whole of the society at the same time that you have a better self-realization even on the employment dimension. But this, I think it's very important that it's not left, as I was saying before, completely to citizens, and that there is a big umbrella that addresses these justice elements, that now there is a transformation, there is going to be a disruption, some people are going to be losing their livelihoods, some other opportunities are growing somewhere else, but they are in a different place, in a different moment in time, they require different skills. We need a map to navigate and to help the population navigate this with a sense of hope, with the impression that the destination can be much better than the current place. No? If we manage to get this in place, we'll have everyone on board collaborating, and the synergies will just explode. No? If we don't manage to do it, we are going to have the kind of barriers that we are already witnessing.
Yeah, I completely agree. This is a tremendous opportunity actually for employment as much as a threat to existing jobs. We only have sort of 10 minutes or so left, and maybe so. I'm going to ask my last question, and we'll close on this one. What do you think electricity markets, or perhaps energy markets more widely, will look like in 10 years' time? Jeff?
Okay, so I think there's a couple of important trends here. So let's fast forward to a market where you're getting a rapidly increasing share of renewables. The issues of that system are kind of changing from one where you're happily absorbing into an existing system a different sort of power, to one in which it's starting to manifest in kind of like the issues of having kind of more variable resources in that system, which means you're moving from a kind of like a just some new power coming on to a system that you're going to have to integrate new things into. So an integration tends to mean in markets different approaches. So instead of a one-way system, which very traditional power markets have been, which is large central generation to very passive consumers, what you're ending up with typically, because you've got local renewables, you've got large scale other renewables, and they go when the sun's shining, when the wind's blowing, when the resources are there. What you're looking for is a much more active demand side in those markets. So you want to activate the demand side, which means much more cost-reflective pricing in markets, so real-time pricing, and that's typically pricing reflecting constraints on networks and other issues going on in there, which means the actual price of power to generate it could be incredibly low, as we've talked about. You know, it could be zero in some of those systems, but the cost of overcoming constraints and getting people to move demand around is where you're going to have a lot of the market activity and a lot of the market value coming in there. Because if you want to build the smallest electricity system that you can, it has to be one that's A, very efficient, so bringing on all of those kind of energy efficiency measures you were talking about, Rob, but also one in which you are minimizing constraints, which means matching as close as is possible supply and demand. And that means that demand comes to meet available supply rather than the traditional way around, the supply following a very passive demand. And that means a lot of different ways of pricing things, a lot of different ways of incentivizing participants to do the right thing for the system in there. So it becomes a much more hands-on system, and probably one that's a lot more automated as well.
Okay, so your focus is on the demand side and a smarter demand side. In this world, how are you remunerating investors in renewables? Are they going to continue to get fixed price contracts as they've had in the past, or are they going to be in a more price volatile world as well? And if so, how are you going to make that attractive to investors?
So I think certainly it looks in a lot of systems, like in the UK, where most of the subsidy is gone from the market, that either...
But they still get fixed price, don't they? Even if it's below market price, they get £40 per megawatt hour for 15 years. It's not...
It is. So I
de-risked.
I think a lot of other movements are moving towards kind of like long-term power purchase agreements as well. So trying to fix those prices out a long way. So rather than a couple of years, 15 years plus. Yeah. So that's the sort of, certainly because you've got the technology costs coming off a cliff edge. You know, some of those PPAs don't have to be really highly priced. There was a conversation I was having the other day about kind of like thinking about markets and having a floor price of PPAs of £25 a megawatt hour, you know, which is way below wholesale price at the moment, but actually completely doable. From a technology.
Just for the benefit of an audience that might be coming to this as a relatively new topic, the benefit of that floor price would be that your debt could still come into, and you'd have a relatively low risk repayment profile.
Yes.
So you could still get debt banks to lend you money.
With all of the caveats that the project is developed well, the site is good, the policy environment is supportive, as in there's no market barriers and all of that, then yes, if like projects can live with what seems like a very low power price. Right. And that's a function of the technology coming on. I guess the other thing is the falling price of energy storage.
Right.
In all of that, because that can firm up your output, because you can store when you cannot get it into the grid and release it when you can.
All right. Well. So it's a kind of, you're looking for a middle ground. You're looking for smarter demand, more flexibility, maybe some storage. But you still want to protect investors in renewables capacity with a floor price or some sort of mechanism.
It's one option.
Okay.
I'd love to hear what
Zabia has on this. What do you think about? Does that make sense to you? Do you think that's the future?
Yes. My impression is that the current market structure will need to be split in two things that address the two different requirements we have. One is procuring low-cost generation, low-cost energy that needs a guarantee and needs some security and a clear view on what's the recovery that they are going to be getting for the next 15 or 20 years. And this resembles completely the auctions we are having today. Now we had the auctions, or the feed-in tariffs even, as a complement, a regulatory complement to the market to have these technologies deployed. But in the future, what I see is that these mechanisms, these auctions, can become the backbone of the energy market. So it's supply of energy on the long term, so that we can access low financing and that we can get all the benefits from renewable generation, which the current market can do it, because now, I mean, even if we take subsidies out, if we have investments on places because we have still fossil fuel plants bidding in the market, which are setting the price. But once these plants are gone, the price signal is zero. And if it's zero, nobody will be investing on this. So we need, on the one hand, to deal with renewable generation that has different characteristics. And this is long-term energy markets, very similar to auctions. And then we need to address the other leg of the issue, which is flexibility procurement. We need a market setup capable of incentivizing investments on flexibility and on dispatching them on an efficient way. And this perhaps resembles more to the wholesale market that we have today, but without caps on prices, so that there is a clear price signal for the flexibility contribution you are doing, and without needing to be related to this marginal cost on long-term production. I mean, it's a market only for flexibility providers that can incentivize this flexibility production. And this probably needs to cascade down also to the retail market. So the consumer or the user itself at its place should be able to decide whether to contract long-term energy at low price, but which requires the user to adapt the demand to the availability of this generation. And when this is not possible, maybe contract another kind of energy which comes from flexibility sources at a higher price. But for these time spots when it's not available to adapt its demand to the other generation. And with this kind of dynamics, linking all the pieces together, we can get to this collaborative energy system that Jeff was commenting, where the demand takes an active participation both in the operation of the system and in defining it, in defining the investments itself that are taking place. No? So yeah, I see this kind of reconfiguration, but I also see that the 10 years, it's really a very short, it looks very short, but I mean, we should have it completed before that, because 10 years is the kind of time window that we are facing for being on track. No? So it's a transformation that I think it's not far because we have the tools, but it needs a kind of, again, a holistic vision on how to approach it and to structure the system on a convenient way.
Okay, so we're out of time, and 10 years is a very short time. We've got an awful lot to do. There's a really, really urgent problem to be solved, so I think that's a very good note to have left it on. I could have this conversation for the rest of the afternoon. We could talk about many more aspects of this. It's been extremely enjoyable. I'd like to thank Xavier for joining us, for experimenting with the technology with us. The technology appears to have worked. Thank you, my technician, hiding off camera. Thanks, Jeff. Thanks I'm pointing to the screen, but thanks to those of you that asked questions, and thanks also to those of you that were listening and taking part by dialing into the webinar. And we're done. Thank you very much.